Hi, I'm DJ Chaotica. I tend to be a pretty big reader of books. Most of the time it's on my Kindle because, frankly, carrying around the sheer quantity of literature that I tend to read is kind of painful on my back. But I thought I would list off a couple of the urban fantasy series that I've been reading kind of over time. Some of them aren't necessarily a series, like this one. This is The Host by Stephanie Meyer. Yes, the chick who wrote Twilight. This is a book about a bunch of aliens that basically have invaded Earth, and because they don't necessarily have a physical form like we do, they take over people's bodies. So this is a story of how one of those takes over a human and kind of learns a little bit more about humanity, and in the process, kind of starts getting a little anti-home, so to speak. Um, Typically, I tend to read series though, because frankly, I devour books. I read really, really fast. I can finish several I have finished long books in like 3 to 4 hours. So typically I tend to read series. Um, for example, one that just came out and went to the movie theaters, the Vampire Academy Collection by Richelle Mead. The movie is complete ass. I know this. The books are really good. It's, if I remember, a six book series. It takes place in a world where there's two kinds of vampires. One that doesn't feed on people until they die, and the other one that basically they're soulless walking monsters that you associate, the ones that go in the night, catch fire, blah blah blah. And there's Dampiers, and they are the protectors of the good vampires. So basically, it's a young adult setting. I tend to drift back and forth between young adult books and adult books for some reason. I don't know. I have problems. You know this. Same author, adult series. This is the Succubus series by Richelle Mead. It's also, I think, about 7 or 8 books. It follows the story of a woman who was originally in ancient Greece, who, for whatever reason that she doesn't even really seem to understand, cheats on her husband and ends up signing her soul over to the devil, for lack of a better term. I think it's actually technically a succubus. I don't know, Lilith specifically. And her trials and tribulations and having to fulfill her end of the evil bargain, so to speak, where she has to, of course, have sex with people and steal parts of their souls. It's a really interesting book, and it kind of goes out and diverges and shows off a couple of other preternatural species as well through the course of it. The ending's a little sad, a little sappy. Um, but overall, it's a good book. Richelle has a really good way of just writing that it flows really well and it's easy to read, so it's a quick read, so it's good times. I know DJ Spellfire will back me up on this one. This is the Anita Blake series by Laurel K. Hamilton. I think I dropped it around book 10 or book 11 because it started going off into the weeds and I couldn't keep up with it anymore. But I have quite a few of them. And a lot of people recommend them. Um, Anita Blake's a vampire hunter. They are officially a sanctioned kind of like a U.S. Marshal in this world, where she also is a necromancer. So she has to raise the dead, otherwise the dead things start raising around her. It's kind of weird. And she has a lot of interesting interactions with the master of the city of St. Louis, Jean Claude, and the local werewolf pack, which is headed up by a guy named Richard. It goes back and forth and it kind of gets a lot of involved. There's a lot of side characters. There's also like were jaguars and were rats and a lot of different preternatural species throughout the book. So this is by Ilona Andrews. It's the Kate Daniels series. Ilona Andrews is actually a wife-husband writing duo. Um, so there's a group of people in the world that basically they're kind of like sort of like the preternatural police where they kind of go around and take care of any issues or conflicts between groups or what have you. There's a lot of different species. Again, lots of different wares, where hyenas, where lions, where tigers, where bears, away. And they all kind of live in a big kind of cluster where they all have to kind of figure out how to get along and what have you. But what's interesting about this novel is it's set in the modern world, but what happened is our time mark, kind of basically where technology is kind of hitting a peak, ends up causing magic to come in a big wave and kind of crash against it, basically leveling anything that was technologically advanced. So there's back and forth periods of where only magic works and where only technology works. So cars have things like the modern combustion engine, but also a magic water fueled engine on top of that that is apparently really loud and really sucks. And they're, you have to mix magic torches along with electrical outlets. MP3 players don't really work, obviously, it goes back and forth. And, as the wave comes up, the other one goes down. So if technology is working, you have electricity and phones and things like that. But if magic's up, then the phones don't work, and lots of other things get a little sketchy. One of the other interesting things in this, there are vampires in it, but they're controlled by a group of people that basically kind of ride along in their heads, kind of like they drive them, they pilot them. So vampires are basically mindless, monstrous creatures where if they're not being controlled, they kind of get a little out of control and go on rampages and what have you. There's lots of interesting mythical creatures that come up in this book, and there's generally just a lot of interesting mythos. Kate Daniels herself is kind of a bit of a mystery for a while in the books. I don't really want to say why she's a mystery, so to speak. But she eventually kind of learns to deal with what she's got ability wise and what have you, and it gets interesting. This is Grave Witch by Kalayna Price. I think there's only 2 or 3 books out for this so far. Basically, it follows Alex Kraft. She is a private investigator, and she consults for the police department as well. She's basically got this ability to talk to the recently deceased, and she apparently can also talk to death itself, which is kind of interesting. He's one of several, I guess, Grim Reapers is the better way to put it. People are basically trying to kill her, but the interesting fallout is whenever she uses her ability, her second sight, to kind of look and speak with the dead, it makes her actual real life vision go kaput. There's a lot of fae inside of this world, um, as you would expect to see, the unseelie, kind of good, bad, what have you. It's an interesting mishmash. The plot is very interesting, where she ends up discovering things about her own family over time, and problems that her friends kind of end up running into and kind of getting caught in the backlash of her existence. So that's kind of interesting. I'm getting kind of down to the bottom of the actual stuff I still own in hardcovers. Um, Patricia Briggs writes the Mercedes Thompson series. Yes, I bought hardcovers because I wanted to read it that much. Mercy is a shapeshifter coyote, and her father, her biological father, ends up dying when she's really young, so her mother doesn't really know what to do with her, and decides to leave her with uh, a guy named Bran, who basically is the Merrick of the werewolves, aka the king of the werewolves all over the world. And she learns basically pack structure and things along those lines, but basically feels like an outsider, which obviously she kind of is. So she ends up kind of taking off and making her way down into a world where she learns how to be an auto mechanic with a guy named Z, who turns out to be Faye, which is kind of awesome. So Faye seem to be here and there and everywhere and everything I seem to be reading. There's a local guy, a local werewolf head in the town that she's in, the Colombian Basin Master Adam Halpman, and they kind of clash back and forth. There's also a vampire seed in the area that's kind of in a little bit of turmoil, because as people start getting older and older with the vampires, they get a little loco in the cabeza, so to speak. But it's a really interesting series. I just read I actually just finished the latest installment that just came out 2 weeks ago, maybe. And the story does keep getting more and more interesting. You keep learning more about her background. Although the last 2 books have kind of ended up in this a similar situation, which is kind of weird. I don't really know how to explain it other than that without giving away spoilers. I'm trying not to spoil things about you guys. Uh, this is the Chicagoland Vampire series by Chloe Neill. Basically, a graduate student at one of the local colleges ends up getting attacked by a rogue vampire, and the master of one of the four vampire houses in the city, ends up changing her over to being a vampire in order to save her life. This whole series is centered around I wouldn't really call them like fraternities, but I mean that's the best kind of comparison, I guess. There's four houses and a set of rogue vampires that are all in Chicago trying to kind of keep the peace. They can only change so many vampires a year, so it's not like there's like a crazy outgrowing population. And they had been under wraps until recently when one of the other older vampires decided that it was time for them to come out of the coffin, so to speak, and reveal the fact that they existed to the world, which of course put people into a tizzy, and people were freaking out. And so the story basically follows Merritt's journey through learning how to be a vampire and her relationships with her best friend, who ends up discovering she's a preternatural of her own. Her grandfather, pardon me, is the ombudsman, who is basically kind of the supernatural liaison between the police, in which he used to be a former cop in Chicago, and the supernatural community, which includes trolls and river nymphs and werewolves, fae, again the fae, sorcerers, sorceresses. So there's a pretty big variety of general preternaturals in this. This is actually the first two books in the series. There are 8 or 9 at this point, I think. So it's pretty long. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of it out there. There's another series that I read that I don't think I have, the Cat Adams series, where there's a woman who started working out as a security guard, and during one job in the very first chapter of the book, she ends up getting bitten by a vampire, but doesn't actually die. So she kind of ends up in this weird half and half state, and she gets some of the pluses, but also some of the minuses along with it. So it's an interesting book. It's a funky kind of thing. Uh, she turns out to have powers that end up getting awakened because of being bit by a vampire. I won't go too much down because that doesn't get revealed for a little bit, but her ex-boyfriend is a very powerful sorcerer. Um, she competes with another guy who runs another agency, a private investigation security agency type thing, who is also a very powerful sorcerer in his own right. Yeah, it's interesting. She has family issues with her mother being an alcoholic, amongst other things. Her grandmother constantly defending the mother. Her best friend is a really like top tier psychic to the point of amazing accuracy, like unheard of accuracy, even inside of that entire universe. So it's kind of an interesting book. Things have been progressing a little slowly in the latest editions. Her love life gets bizarrely complicated for whatever reason. I don't know, whatever. So that's what I have sitting around here for physical copies and a couple of other ones. So hopefully that gives you something to read if you're interested in an urban fantasy.